to take my stand. Yeah, I am a roaring lamb. I am a roaring lamb, and the time has come to take my stand.
Hello, I'm Donna Skell.
And I'm Tiffany Ross.
Welcome to Roaring Lambs. Our story today is an amazing story. Colonel Ken Cordier is a POW from the Vietnam War, and we can't even imagine the things that he had to endure. But you're going to hear more about that in just a moment.
This episode of Roaring Lambs is brought to you by LifeStoriesCompany.com.
Welcome, Ken, to our show today. We're so excited to have you. It's an honor, and thank you for your service. As I mentioned a moment ago, you're a colonel, and we highly respect you and everything that you have endured for our freedom. You have a big story, and we always like to start at the beginning. So if you would, tell us a little bit about your childhood and your early years.
Well, it's fairly unremarkable. I was born in February 1937 in Canton, Ohio, and grew up there till I reached the age of 4.5, which is one of my first really strong memories, when my uncle, who was an Air Force pilot during the war, took me up in a Piper Cub. And unknown to my mother that he was doing this, she was quite put out about it. But anyway, he took me up and, moved the airplane around, and that's how I got bitten by the flying bug. From that moment on, all I could think about was being a pilot someday like my uncle.
Nice.
Well, during my early years, I made model airplanes, and just thought a lot about flying. During the war, most toys were wood or cardboard, and I had a cardboard instrument panel with dials that you could move, and a little manuscript of how to fly. And I would play flying that airplane and so on. And then about the time I was 8 and 9 years old, I got strep throat every year, really bad. And when I was 10, I contracted rheumatic fever.
Oh.
And fortunately, my mother was a strong-willed person, and she rode herd on me and made me follow the doctor's orders, and I had 3 months of bed rest at 10 years of age.
Oh.
Wow.
And the year after that, I had very limited activity. I remember she was always taking my pulse and not allowing me to be overactive. Well, what that did for me personally was it put me 2 years behind my contemporaries in playing sports. Consequently, I never developed an interest or capability in playing sports, and to this day I call myself sports apathetic. Well, I grew up through high school and graduated third in my class. I was always third. And then went on to college. I went to the University of Akron, where I got a degree in mechanical engineering. A lot of brain effort on my part, and I never used it, because in college I elected to take reserve officer training in the Air Force, and with the idea that when I graduated I'd be able to go to flying school. Well, I got up to the graduation point, and they gave me the flying physical, and I flunked because of my eyesight. They said my depth perception was lacking.
Wow.
And so I couldn't be a pilot. Well, that was devastating. So I went along with the gag and had a 3-year commitment. And I went to Chanute Air Base, where I was part of the cadre to write the course and teach the first class in Minuteman Launch Officer. Well, at the end of the first year, I got a physical. And I complained to the doc at the end of it. I said, you know, my death perception supposedly is not up to speed, and for that reason I was not allowed to go to pilot training. And he said, oh, a lot of people have a problem with that test. You look in a scope thing and you're supposed to, there's 3 donuts and you're supposed to tell which one is closest to you. And I flunked that. And he says, a lot of people have a problem with that. I've got another test, which he gave to me, and I passed it 100%. He said, there's nothing wrong with your death perception. So that was at the end of my first year in the Air Force as a ground pounder. And began a 11-month quest to move my application first for reserve status and then volunteer for pilot training. And finally, after a year, I got a class start date at Laughlin Air Base down in Del Rio, and I began pilot training. And I just loved it. I mean, it was just the most wonderful experience to, and at the point I went through, they had dropped the prop, given you a few hours in a prop aircraft, and it started you right out in a jet. Yes, I thought that was great.
Wow. So I have a question, Ken.
Sure.
You had laser focus, if you will, even as a youngster, to be a pilot and to have this training and
Right.
pretty regimented, I would think, you know, just at least in your mindset. So speaking about just even spiritual aspects of your life up until that point, was religion part of your life, but it was just kind of regimented and not necessarily this relationship that we talk about with the Lord?
Well, I don't think many 12-year-olds, 14, even 14-year-olds have a real strong relationship with God. But I grew up in a fundamentalist sect called the Church of the Brethren. And they are so fundamental that if you're a member of that church, which I was, you can put in for conscientious objection and not have to serve in the military. Well, none of that for me. I wanted to be in the military. So that's how that phase went. And I went to church every Sunday and participated in the activities, and I was a believer.
Good. And when and how did you meet your wife? Because before you went off
well,
to
that came
Vietnam.
later. My last year in last year in college, I met this young woman and fell in love and got married before I graduated from college. So she was with me when I went on active duty and then on to pilot training. And we had our first child at that time. That was my daughter, Ann. And then when I went to pilot training in Del Rio, my second child was born, my son, Louis.
So were you immediately called to active duty once the war started?
Oh, well, no, I was on active duty now through pilot training and then assigned to a squadron at the first F-4 wing in the Air Force in Tampa, Florida, MacDill. And so I went on, graduated from pilot training, again third, but I was high enough I got my choice of assignments, which I jumped on the opportunity to go to the F-4C at MacDill. And this was the newest fighter in the Air Force. And so I went to MacDill and checked out in the F-4 and combat training there, survival schools and all that. And then in the spring of 1965, the war was heating up and they sent my squadron to Thailand to be the first F-4 squadron in combat. And it was not a permanent assignment, it was a temporary duty. And we did 4 months over there, and I got 59 combat missions over North Vietnam and Laos. None of our missions were over South Vietnam. So that was my 1965 experience. Came back to MacDill, to the States, and went through an upgrade from back seat pilot to front seat pilot, which is aircraft commander. And that culminated in the spring of '66, and I stood by flying training missions until I was assigned to Cam Ranh Bay, which is in South Vietnam. And so back to the combat zone, and this time though I'm flying out of South Vietnam with at least half of my missions in South Vietnam. And that's where I learned to love napalm. Napalm is a terrible weapon, but it's deadly. And I used to get up early in the morning and go down to the scheduling board, and if I didn't have the tail number that was identified as loaded with napalm, I'd erase it and change it with one. I figured if I picked one weapon, and that's either dive bombing or a low-level napalm, and did it every day, I'd get very good at it, and I was. And I won't get into that, but I had some very challenging missions. Well, this brings us up now. I'm near the end of my tour. I was 10 days from being rotated back to the States. And I took off on this mission over North Vietnam to escort a B-66 electronic warfare bomber, unarmed. So we had F-4s would escort them in case the MiGs came up to attack them, which happened occasionally. And that was a much sought after mission because there's a chance to get a shot at a MiG. And that's every fighter pilot's dream, is to shoot down enemy aircraft. Well, on this day, the 2nd of December 1966, the hunter became the hunted. And I'm flying along, making turns like this. We kept up a constant turn so we could keep our speed up and yet not pass the B-66, which was a slower airplane. So I had just completed a turn, and without warning, I don't know, I expected if the SAM was launched at me, I'd get a warning call from this B-66. Well, I found out later that he didn't have the warning gear. He was just electronic warfare. So I'm making this turn, as I said, and all of a sudden there's a thump, and the airplane literally lurched, and faster than I can tell this story, the airplane went out of control. I had no stick authority, so that meant the tail was shot off because I was fishtailing. And again, this is faster than I can tell it. I went like this, which caused negative G's, and I was up against the canopy. And then I went the other way, positive G's, I was pushed down into the seat. Well, this only took a couple of seconds for this fishtail. I realized this was a gut shot, and the plane was mortally damaged because the engine fire lights were on, flashing. All the warning lights were on. I'm out of control, and I just had time to yell to the back seater, "We're hit, eject." And the poor guy, it was his first mission over North Vietnam, and he was about a mile behind the airplane the whole time. And he didn't know what was happening. So he hesitated, and I thought, well, you know, he's on his own. So I pulled my handle, and the canopy went off, and the plane, the ejection seat shot out of the airplane. He later described it to me as like a cork popping out of a champagne bottle.
Wow.
Okay, so this is close, you know, because as I came out of the airplane, and there's a little drogue chute that stabilizes the seat so it doesn't tumble, my seat comes out of the airplane and stabilizes, and when I opened my eyes, which is another few seconds, I saw my F-4 blow up.
Oh my goodness.
So we're that close to being annihilated in the
Wow.
airplane. So within just a few seconds, I got out and escaped the aircraft blowing up. Well, that's a close one. So now my seat has started to descend like that. Still have the little drogue chute, and I'm going down. Now this happened at 24,000 feet altitude, and I was doing about 500 knots, 500 miles an hour. So now I'm going to fall quite a ways from 24,000 feet down to 13, where the automatic ejection sequence takes place. You can be unconscious in these Martin Baker seats, and as long as you get out of the airplane, everything's automatic until you get to the lower altitude, and the ejection sequence will chop the leg restraints, the lap belt, and the shoulder harness, and then we call it a butt kicker. There's a pneumatic cushion that would push you out of the seat. And as you came out of the seat, you're connected to the seat, and the lanyard would pull the D-ring, which allows the parachute to deploy. So you could be unconscious during all this, and the first thing you'd have to do is, when you hit the ground, get rid of the parachute. Okay? Well, I'm not that far ahead in my thinking. I'm just looking down to see what's down below me. And now this is all again in just a few seconds. I look down between my feet, and to my horror, they fired 2 SAMs at me, and here's the second one came up and exploded right below me. Big red and black fireball, and I was headed right for it. And I just had time to close my eyes and hold my breath, and in a flash, I was through that fireball. Now I've got to digress and tell you how a surface-to-air missile, a Russian SAM, works. It's been described as a flying telephone pole. The top pointy end of it, like this, for about 4 feet, has all the guidance and the radar and all that stuff. And then the next 12 or 14 feet is just a tube loaded with black gunpowder, and on the inside of the metal casing are rows and rows of steel rods, and they're glued to the inside of this tube, which is the missile body. And when the powder explodes, it shatters these rings of metal rods, and that creates an expanding ring of shrapnel. Can you visualize that?
Yes.
Goodness, yes.
It's growing like this, and that shrapnel is what shot my airplane down. So here I am through the fireball, and there's this ring of shrapnel which is already grown, and I was at the right angle and the right airspeed that I fell right through the fireball and the hole in the donut, I call it, of that ring of shrapnel, and I didn't get a scratch. Not even a John Kerry splinter on my arm. That's another story. He was in Vietnam, you know.
Yeah.
Went home early because he had 3 Purple Hearts, and I only got 2. So anyway, I fall through this, and I'm on the other side now, and the only injury I had, if you call it that, was my eyebrows and eyelashes were burned off, and the hair on my arms where the flame went up the sleeves. That's all I got out of it.
Amazing.
So here I am now, falling, and I decided, I remember this vivid thought, if I don't get out of this seat, I'll ride it into the ground, because that little drogue parachute surely was burned off by the fireball. And that's key to the automatic seat opening sequence. So on my mind, against all my training, I decided I'm going to manually get out of that seat. And I was in a panic. It's the only time I felt this tightness in my chest, where I had a feeling of panic. And I had this panicky feeling, I've got to get out of this seat. So I pulled the handles, which caused the seat belt and leg restraints and all that to be severed. And I pushed away from the seat. Now I'm free. It's just me and my parachute. Well, again, against all my training, I decided I've got to get this parachute open so I see the silk. I was way too high. You're supposed to wait till you're at lower altitude, because at high altitude, you have an opening shock. And I proved that to be true. I grabbed the D-ring of the parachute and pulled it, and bam! The chute deployed, but I was much too high, probably 5,000 feet, a mile too high. So there's this big opening shock to the point that it ripped out 2 of the panels of my parachute. And there's shreds of cloth fluttering on these 2 triangular shaped panels. What this did, it allowed me to descend faster than I would have if the parachute was intact. Just kept ignoring all my training. Anyway, I've got this parachute. Praise the Lord, I've got a good chute, and I'm coming down. Well, I had a long ride because I was too high when I opened it, and so I'm going down, 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 down. Cloud deck below me. Well, up to this point, I haven't been able to see what is below me on the ground. So I get down to the cloud deck and I fall through it, and it's maybe 500 feet thick. All I remember is a very serene and quiet, lovely feeling, if it wouldn't have been such a tense moment, falling through that cloud. And when I broke out, I just thought, oh, this is not my lucky day. Down below me are rice paddies and villages. And where's the forest? All this forest I've flown over on all these missions in Vietnam, no forest, just rice paddies. So I knew I was going to be captured as soon as I hit the ground. Now, another thing I did that was not a good move, we had a survival radio. While I'm floating down, I should have got that out and tried to make radio contact with anybody else, any other Americans in the area. At least they would have not reported me as presumed dead. Because of the fireball of my aircraft, which was seen by the other flight member, they said all we saw was a fireball and no chutes. Well, hello. Of course there's no chutes at 24,000 feet. And he didn't stay around long enough to even make one circle to, see if I got out. And my backseater. My backseater also got out, and I saw him coming down above me. Well, I was so shaken that I thought, no, I don't want to take my radio out, because surely I'll fumble it and drop it. Another big mistake. Had I made the call and anybody, any American heard it, they could have told my family that they got a radio call from me, and I'm probably alive. As it is, I was missing in action status for 3 years. Family didn't know if I survived or not. Well, now the ground's coming up at me, and I hit the ground and look around and hear these farmers running across the rice paddy, and I took my pistol and I threw it as far as I could and did the brave act of standing up and putting up my hands. Well, I was the first American they'd ever seen, and they were very nervous also. And they didn't rough me up or mistreat me, but they had, 2 of them had rifles, and they pointed at me and went like this and marched me to their village. We got to the village, and they put us in a room of the school, a little schoolhouse, and for probably a couple hours, curious villagers were coming by and peeking in the window and looking at us. So that was interesting that we were just held there. They didn't bother us or harass us in any way. And finally the army came, and then the rough stuff started. They pulled us out of the school and stripped us to our jockey shorts, took our boots, of course, tied our hands behind us, and blindfolded us, marched us off, and threw us in the back of a truck. Off we went to Hanoi, stopping at every village along the way, where they'd roll up the side curtain of the truck, and you'd hear a guy with a bullhorn, of course Vietnamese, whipping up the locals and angry voices, and every stop was the same. Angry crowd would gather, and then they'd start throwing stones at us and whacking us with sticks. Not enough to injure you, but it was disconcerting being blindfolded.
Yeah.
Well, this happened all afternoon and evening, and all night, and eventually we got to Hanoi. I could tell we were in a city because every intersection there was loudspeakers blaring propaganda. Couldn't understand it, but you could tell from the tone. And we drove for some, maybe a half hour, and we came to a stop, and you could tell we went through a gate, and then they hauled us out of the truck and pushed us. I didn't know where, but I could tell I was being put in a room by myself and pushed down to sit on the ground and wait for something to happen. Well, something did happen, and an interrogator came in and started asking questions. I got past name, rank, and service number, okay. Then he wanted military information, which I refused. And I could go on for another 15 minutes about the interrogations, but they quickly ended in torture. And I must describe the torture because I had to deal with it several times. They put your wrists like this in manacles, that's clamps, not handcuffs, behind you, like this, behind you. And then they took a rope, and I'm laying on the ground, take a rope and foot on my back and pull up on this rope until my elbows touched.
Oh, gosh.
Like this, in the behind, with the elbows touching. And then they just went away and left me until I screamed loud enough and long enough, they'd come in, loosen the ropes, and start it up again. Well, the first time I came out of the ropes, I made another mistake. The interrogator came in and started asking questions, and I said, "This is barbaric." I'll never forget these words. "This is barbaric. You're torturing me, and I need to see a doctor." And the guy looked at me and he said, "You're not bleeding. What's wrong?" I said, "I think my back is broken. I'm in a lot of pain." Big mistake. Because when they put me in the ropes again, I'm on the ground. This time, they hogtied me and put a rope around my neck and my ankles and arched me backwards as far as they could. New meaning to pain. Well, this was so bad, I remember banging my head on the cement floor, trying to knock myself out, and you can't do it. Just made my head sore.
Wow.
So it went on like that, and then my last torture was when they wanted me to sign a war crimes confession. 3 points: committed crimes against the Vietnamese people, killing innocent women and children, and my government was in an illegal and immoral and unjust war. I heard those words many times. And then the last point was, I thank the Vietnamese people for their lenient and humane treatment. We call it L&H. And that ended it. Once I signed that doggone confession, why, they packed me up and issued me some striped pajamas and a tin cup to drink from. And one humane thing, they gave us a mosquito net. Mosquitoes were so thick at night you could hear them buzzing. So that began my 6 years, 3 months, and 1 day experience in Vietnam.
Ken, so first of all, that had to have been so surreal, at least at first, to think, surely this isn't happening, and then you have the pain, so I guess you figure, this is happening. But how did you not lose hope? Did you?
I had a mantra, never give up and never give in. And I was fueled by my faith and by my hatred. I grew to hate those torturers and the interrogators and the people that made our life so miserable. And I can say that I would fantasize about all the different ways I might kill these guys.
6 years.
3 months and 2 days.
You're in a cell. By yourself?
No, I was only in solitary for 1 month. They were capturing a lot of U.S. Aircrew at the time, and they needed the bed space. So,
So how many in a room?
well, 2 or 3. One day at interrogation, I was asked if I would like to have a cellmate, and I said, sure. Well, if you promise to obey the camp regulations, which was impossible, we'll allow you to have a cellmate. And I said, okay. And in walked my backseater, Mike Lane.
Oh, wow.
So he was my first cellmate, and we had this tiny little 7 by 9 foot cell, and
And I remember
lived there for 6 months with Mike.
you told us that the menu, the daily menu, was cabbage soup.
Well, that was in the wintertime. Winter was cabbage, boiled cabbage till it was slimy, and a bowl of rice. Then in the summer, it was swamp greens, we called it. Think of a cross between seaweed and spinach. Again, boiled till it's slimy, no meat. But the fall was the good time. For about 3 months, we'd get squash, a couple of chunks of boiled squash. And I like
Wow.
squash.
Oh, well, that's good.
Yeah.
And it wasn't slimy, I'm sure.
Yeah.
Wow, that's even hard to imagine all that time.
And I went from my shoot down weight, which is about what I am now, around 162. I'll never know how much weight I did lose, but from the rib cage and the hip bones and the shoulder bones, I would guess somewhere around 115 pounds.
Wow.
So how did you finally, after all of those years and months,
Days.
get the news that you were liberated, that it was over?
Well, thanks to our president, Richard Nixon, who we all admire and think well of, regardless of Watergate, he officiated our position at the Paris Peace Conference. And the Paris Peace Conference was going nowhere month after month until the president said, that's enough of that. And he sent the B-52s over Hanoi and Haiphong, bombed them every night for a little over 2 weeks. And they called it the Christmas bombing campaign. It took place in the 3rd week of December. And that got their attention, and they agreed to talk seriously in Paris. And within a month, it was all signed. And one of the things that Henry Kissinger made sure was in that agreement was that within 10 days or whatever, all the POWs had to be notified in their own language of the agreement for the release of prisoners. And that included the Vietnamese. And there were far more, many times more North Vietnamese that were prisoners in the South. And they were also notified. So we knew there was going to be 4 groups. The first group went out just before Valentine's Day, and then the second group, that was me, was the 4th of March.
And so you're a free man, finally, after 6 years, 3 months, and a couple of days.
Yeah.
What did that feel like?
It's hard to describe. I mean, it was as much of a change as going from being a hotshot fighter pilot
Yeah.
to being humiliated in that prison. To turn it back the other way, it was just startling.
How was the transition for you back into normal life?
I only had 3 months of convalescent leave. Some of the guys took 6 months, but I wanted to go to the Armed Forces Staff College, which had a start date in August. So I returned to active duty in August so I could go to the Staff College. Did that answer your question?
What about your family?
I'm wondering with your family.
Oh, the family.
Your wife and children and,
That was really difficult
yeah.
because they were totally undisciplined. They wouldn't even flush a toilet when they used it. Clothes littering the floor in their bedroom, and they were just undisciplined. Well, of course, for me, that was pretty hard to take, and I frustrated myself by trying to teach them some fundamentals of housekeeping, and tried everything, and tried to bribe them to make their bed. Money, double their allowance, didn't work. Didn't work. So that was difficult, and my soon-to-be ex-wife did not cooperate, and she thought it was fine the way they had been living. In retrospect, I kind of wished I would have just left them in Tampa where they were and gone off. But I felt beholden to these two kids, and so I stayed with it for 5 years.
Wow.
And I frequently said I'd rather spend another year in Hanoi than live those 5 years again. It was very difficult. And I'm not apologizing or saying that to feel sorry for me. It's just that I just couldn't reconcile.
Right. So looking back, you can see how God saved you several times, going through that ring of fire, going through that ring of shrapnel, being able to live through the imprisonment. I'm sure there were others that didn't. And you get out and...
There were a lot of foxhole Christians. I was strong in my faith, and we would have church service regardless, and it was strictly forbidden, but we would tap on the wall. And I won't go into the details, but even in the worst times, every Sunday we would have a church service.
Yeah, I remember one time you told me that you actually created a language out of these taps. It wasn't Morse code because it might have
No,
been
you
recognized.
can't tap a dash.
Right,
Yeah.
so you created a whole language in which you were able to communicate to the
Well,
other prisoners.
we had a matrix code where A was tap, tap, B was tap, 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 C, tap, 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 and so on down to E. We had a 5 by 5. And the problem is our alphabet has 26 characters, but we only had 25 in this matrix because Z was 5 taps, space, 5 taps. So some not too bright person, that was one of the first guys shot down, made a big mistake. He said, we'll just drop the K. We'll leave the K out and substitute C. Well, my initials are KC, and they were always misspelling my name. But
So,
and you got very fast.
Yeah.
You got to the point where it's like a telegrapher in Morse code.
Oh my
You don't
gosh.
even count the taps, you just think.
Yeah,
you know.
what they're trying to say.
Yeah.
So you knew that God had preserved your life and you believed that it was for a purpose. And so you and your wife got divorced. And then where did you go?
Well, I was in Germany. I had my first assignment in New Mexico, and then I got assigned to headquarters in Germany. You may have seen a bit of TV coverage of the processing camp with all the tents at Ramstein. Well, that's where I was stationed, Ramstein.
Wow.
What was your question again?
Well, I want to cover two things. You met a beautiful woman in
Right.
Germany, and God saved you once again from an unbelievable situation.
Oh, you want to go ahead with that?
Sure.
Okay. Well, when I got divorced, I moved into a small apartment in the bachelor officer quarters. And by the way, after 2 weeks, my son came to me and he said, I don't like living with Mom and Ann. I want to come and live with you. And I said, oh, of course. So I took him into my little apartment there. So one night I was over at the Officers Club, which was just across the street, and I was having a drink with a fellow on the staff there, and he was a bachelor living in the quarters, and he said, there's things you need to know. And short of it was, you need to join the Porsche Club. I said, no, I drive a Corvette. He said, no, it's just a social thing. you need to join the ski club. I said, well, I guess I could learn to ski. And the third one was the wine club. I says, I'm for that. So those three things are where all the social life takes place.
Wow.
And he looked over at the bar and he said, now there's somebody. She's a member of all three of those clubs. Come on, I'll introduce you. Which he did. And I love to tell this. She looked me up and down and she said, Ken, you're Ken, I'm Barbie. With a combination like that, how could you go wrong? And I'm thinking, bingo.
I love it.
And that's how it began.
She is a wonderful lady, and I've had the privilege to get to know both of you through our Roaring Lambs Bible study, and she's just so full of joy and fun. And
Yeah.
but there was a day on the German Autobahn that could have all been taken away.
Yeah. This was the third time the hand of God was around me. Otherwise, I would have perished. I'm driving down the Autobahn from Sembach, where I had been transferred, to a meeting at Ramstein, which was about 22 miles away. And I'm just cruising along the normal Autobahn speed, 85, and all of a sudden, bam! And it was so startling. The windshield was shattered, not shattered, but crazed, like a spider web. And there was a hole in the windshield just the size, about that big, where this piece of metal came about that long and about that wide, came through the windshield. Now, from a vehicle coming the other way at about 80 or so, that's 160 or so miles an hour relative speed. That came right through the windshield, and it sheared off the little stem that the rear view mirror hangs on. Just sheared it off, and the rear view mirror ended up in my luggage compartment back between the seats. And so that meant, here's the rear view mirror, here's my head, and this thing came through. It was about maybe 6 inches. If it had been that much to the left, it would have hit me in the head.
Yeah.
It killed me instantly. I'd have gone off the road, and they would have not had any idea what happened. They'd just assumed that I lost control of my Corvette and
Wow.
wiped myself out. So
God's hand has certainly been upon
that really
you.
was.
Yeah. Well, all three of those incidences, you've had an amazing life, and each time God preserved you, He protected you, and that's just what our God does.
So I'm supposed to figure out, what is it I'm supposed to do to pay back? Well, God gave me a payback in the form of Barbie, and being married to her is my payback for the 6 bad years.
And it's beautiful.
Yeah, but what am I supposed to do to pay back? And I think it's doing stuff like this. I gave my first talk about my experience about a little over a month after I got back home. We're up in Ohio visiting family, and my then wife's sister asked if I would come and speak to her ladies' organization. I've only been free for a month, and they want me to tell what I call the sob story.
Yeah.
Well, I did, and I've been talking about it ever since. I've given
I
hundreds, literally hundreds of speeches.
And I know on YouTube you have, what, over 1 million views on one of them?
More than 1,200,000.
Wow.
Yeah. Well, for the purpose of this, I like to put in a plug that my YouTube, 1 hour YouTube, is available for viewing. You just Google or go YouTube Ken Cordier, and then click on the frame that says Veteran Tales. That's singular, Veteran Tales. And this thing will pop up.
Yeah.
And when
And
you're
an
having a hard time
abbreviated-
going to sleep some night, watch it.
An abbreviated story is on our YouTube channel as well, Roaring
That's
Lambs
right, yeah.
Ministries YouTube channel. But Ken, your story is one of God's mercy, His protection, Just amazing. And if you don't have Jesus Christ as the center of your life, we pray that hearing this story today might encourage you. God makes all the difference. He sees the things we can't see. He knows what's coming in the future, and He wants to walk with you in your life. I like how our guest did it the other day. He drew this circle and he said, this is you, this is God. What you want to do is make sure God is in the center of your life. And if He isn't, no magic words, no special prayer, just say, God, I want to know you better. Please come into my life and reveal yourself fully to me. And we would love to hear from you. Again, I want you to look up Ken's book, which is Guardian Eagles. You can see it on Amazon. Again, you can go to his YouTube channel. You can find his story on our show as well, and we'd love to hear from you too. So if you'll drop us a line at info@roaringlambs.org. We'd like to know that stories like this are encouraging and motivating to you. And maybe they'll just cause you to go out and roar about the goodness of God.
For sure.
At Life Stories Company, our passion is to preserve your story in a personal memoir. These beautiful books can be shared with both friends and family for generations. For the past 28 years, we have helped over 200 clients share their history and wisdom. As a Christian, what better testimony than to share how God has led you and provided for you? Visit us at lifestoriescompany.com. Sharing your story and honoring God, lifestoriescompany.com.